Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Idea Roastery. I'm Jason.
And I'm Herman.
So, Herman, I want you to tell me about the last thing that you bought that you thought was luxurious.
So I was up in Johannesburg about a week ago, and it's really cold up there, like cold and dry. And I'd wake up in the mornings and my feet would be so cold. So I decided to get myself a pair of slippers. And I went and I tried on, your Stuckies from Woolworths, and I tried on a couple of other bits and pieces. But the slippers that I ended up buying are these sheep wool slippers,
Ah,
right? So it's like proper
they're
sheep's
kind of
wool on
like,
the
are they
inside.
like Uggs? Is it
They're
Ugg?
kind of like Uggs, except the wool kind of curls over the top and it just
Hmm.
creates a much more cozy and fluffy exterior around the ankle. And they're just so comfortable. They are cheaper than Uggs, which I guess is,
Yeah.
but Uggs are not a South African brand, whereas these are actually sewn here in South Africa out of South African
Hmm.
sheep, and they are very comfortable, and I am happy with my purchase.
Yeah. And did you specifically buy them because they were made in South Africa, or did you buy them and they happen to be manufactured locally?
I was pleasantly surprised to see that they were manufactured in South Africa. But now that I'm looking for them, I realize that all of these are manufactured in South Africa, and the only ones that are similar to this that aren't manufactured in South Africa are Uggs. And Uggs you only buy in like high-end stores, whereas these you can get at like your Cape Union Mart or your Trappers or your whatever. And they're all, I mean, there are also some like low-end ones where they use synthetics instead of sheep's wool. But yeah, this seems to be a very South African thing. Like Uggs, the wool is contained all the way inside of it, whereas with this, it kind of curls around the top, and it's a very South African silhouette.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's kind of like the is it Schoenfeld or something like those
Volkswagen.
felt scoons? Yeah, like it's kind of like those. And when you see that it's made in South Africa, like what pers do you believe that it's 100% made in South Africa, or do you think there's parts of it that are maybe not? Like the rubber sole, maybe.
I suspect that the rubber for the sole is not made here, certainly, and I think that the thread is not made here because I mean, maybe it is, but I have my doubts that South Africa manufactures thread in the same way that like China can manufacture thread. And when they say made in South Africa, what they really mean is they mean sewn together in South Africa. Like if I take a look at any textiles, like a shirt or whatever, when it says made in South Africa, what I really assume they mean is they went and they bought a roll of material from somewhere and some thread from somewhere, and then they turned it into a shirt shape in South Africa. Right? So it's not like a end to end, this has all been created here. But I don't think people are thinking about that. People are thinking about what the last stage of the journey for that product has been.
Are they? I think I would maybe disagree a little bit because I think people maybe look at, I mean, everyone's been taught to look at labels. Well, I think a lot of people have been taught to look at labels, not everyone. And you see, like, typically where it comes from. And I guess to a certain extent, you just automatically assume that the whole product has come from there. Like, I know, for instance, with like Apple products for a while, they would say like made in China, assembled in California or something like that. So it would kind of like give it, a disparity between where it was actually assembled versus where it was manufactured. What extent do you think brands should go to in order to keep this sort of, I guess there's a kind of like a promise, right? Because, you see the product label, made in South Africa, made in the UK, wherever. Like, what extent do you expect a company to go through to make sure that that is 100% accurate?
So that's actually quite an interesting question and one that I've grappled with a bit recently. So my sister is a voracious knitter. She's just finished knitting me a really nice sweater, And she got in touch with me recently, and she's like, "Hey, we should start making locally sourced, naturally dyed knitting and crocheting wool for hobbyists." And the premise is this: we get South African wool from South African sheep. We create natural dyes. And so natural dyes are they're tougher to create good, vibrant colors, which is why pretty much all wool you'll ever see is synthetically dyed. And there's also a very limited range of colors that you can do. So like avocado pits make pink, weirdly enough. It's the tannins in the avocado pits. Um, Black beans make like this really royal blue color. And brown onion skins make a vibrant, like almost electric yellow. It's actually quite a sight to behold. Anyhow, we've just dyed up 140 skeins of wool, and we're gonna go and like sell them at craft markets and stuff. But we've been trying to get our messaging right, and our messaging, obviously, it needs to reflect the actual process as well. Is we want to say that these are 100% naturally dyed wool with post-consumer waste, right? And we also want to say it's all made in the Western Cape or in South Africa. Now, the difficult thing about that is that, at what point does that not be true? So I can say, cool, we got the wool in South Africa. Great, check. And it was spun into yarn in South Africa. Then we went and we took a bunch of avocado pits from a restaurant up the road, Nourished. They serve a lot of avocado toast. So I go and I collect avocado pits from them every couple of days. And we go and we boil those and we extract the tannins and we dye the wool with those avocado pits. So I can say I got those avocado pits in South Africa, or I got those avocado pits in the Western Cape. But I don't know if those avocados were grown in South Africa, right? They could have been grown in Brazil and then shipped over here on a container ship. I do suspect that they were grown in South Africa, but here's another one that's a bit more contentious. I know that we don't do any coffee growing in South Africa. Well, I know that there are like there's the Red Bean Initiative by Vita that is grown in South Africa, but the coffee that I've been drinking is certainly not grown in South Africa. It's grown in Ethiopia, Rwanda, Brazil, Colombia, etc., etc. And so I store all my coffee grounds after I've made coffee with them, and we use that to make like a champagne color out of wool. So I can say, this is post-consumer waste, but can I say that the coffee is South African? Because it was definitely not grown here. And so it really comes down to how far are you willing to go to make the claim that this was made in Cape Town?
Yeah. And you've gone even further than that, and you said you want to make it in specifically Cape Town, which means it's probably less likely that you're going to have avocados from there, because I think the avocado regions are maybe
Sure, but I still think I can get away with saying that I source the avocado pits as post-consumer waste in Cape Town. And that's kind of where I'm going to go with that, because it's not like I'm buying avocados from somewhere else in order to make the dyes. I'm actually getting them from a restaurant right up the road.
yeah, yeah. So I mean, it also like I mean, just in general, the story is quite good and it's quite compelling. As in, if you're able to explain the process that you've come to get those different colors, then maybe people will appreciate it more. And do you think that it's going to command either a higher price because it has got this, I guess you would call it a green premium, um, in the positive sense? Do you think it's going to command a higher price? And what is your expectations in terms of the amount that you're going to be able to sell?
So it will have to command well, sorry, in order for this to be a profitable enterprise, we have to sell it at a higher price, right? Because the fact of the matter is that if you get mass manufactured wool from a factory in Vietnam, there is nothing that I can do in South Africa to compete on price with that, right? Unless I get a whole bunch of automated capital and there aren't any employees and I, do it out of the city. It would be, let me put it this way, it would be very difficult to beat Vietnam at making high quality wool. So instead, we're kind of relying on the customer's perception, that good feeling of buying local, and we're also it's going to be targeting a certain kind of person that cares about that sort of thing and cares about natural ingredients that not using toxic synthetic dyes and stuff like that. So our business model relies on there being a green premium over here, and we wouldn't survive otherwise.
Exactly. And I think what this kind of touches on is the kind of like ongoing conversation more recently about this whole dilemma of global manufacturing. As in, obviously, with the US taking stances within bringing in tariffs and stuff like that, a lot of people are, well, a lot of businesses are kind of in a bit of a fuddle as to like where to procure all of these different components. And I think it's part of maybe the ill of our modern society that people have kind of forgotten or not even learned where things come from. Because I think in your case, you've only got, I would say, like a relatively small part of the supply chain. And in terms of the supply chain, you're potentially like upstream from someone who's maybe making like a sweater or someone who's like, making rugs or something like that, or whatever it is that they're going to make. You're like a little bit upstream of that. But you've also got parts that are, sorry, downstream, that you've still got parts that you have to rely on, right? So, for instance, you are getting your materials from it, but you also have things like electricity, and you have things like, I mean, if you use any sort of industrial machinery to like grind the products.
Literally just like we have two induction burners, right? Those are definitely manufactured in China. Like I don't even have to look at the label. They're manufactured in China, right? We have two big stainless steel pots that are induction compatible. Those are also definitely not manufactured here. And that is actually just this is such a small operation. This is just my sister and I like doing it out of her, apartment spare room. When it comes down to like actual big boy manufacturing, very, very few countries in the world have the supply chain set up that they can support large scale manufacturing without relying on outside help. China can do that. China can has, top to bottom manufacturing capability. They can manufacture all the way from the simplest things, iron chains, or actually the simplest things like raw mineral processing, through to complex, super complex things like, aerospace materials and microprocessors. Although that's part of the larger global conversation at the moment as well.
I think it's just talking about the complexity of how these things operate, and there's less awareness. And I guess this is why it's becoming a little bit of more of an issue, is because for a couple of years, well, for a couple of decades, it's almost been that people have just relied on, oh, you can just outsource to China and get it cheaper. And that's driven a lot of profits or profiteering in companies at the detriment of what we have now, which is like kind of like a over dependence. And it's not like if you just looked at the face of it, like, some dude like making wool in Cape Town, like you're like, oh, well, there's, it's perfectly South African product. But then you go and look at like deeper in the layers, like, even having a laptop to sell stuff online, and you need like, infrastructure like electricity, transformers to kind of, provide electricity to your factory, and those kind of things. Like all of these kind of things are built into the system, but people are way less aware of that because it's kind of like buried in sort of deeper levels of the supply chain.
Yeah, we're a heavily globalized international economy.
Well, yeah, I mean, globalized in the sense that China's got everything, right? And I
Yeah.
think one of the things to their great benefit is that they have managed to take, I guess, the whole supply chain of like raw materials all the way up to like the finished good, and they've been able to like sort of have a whole sort of perspective on each component. And I think that's, especially as you said with the microchips, I think that is where there's going to be a bit of a challenge, because there's almost like there's I mean, there's people thinking about manufacturing. What are we manufacturing now, and how can we do do that. Like automobiles is one of them, like cars and machinery. But also in the future, is it going to be like future technology like solar panels and stuff that we're going to kind of really need to rely on in order to have our day-to-day lives? And I think that's where the conversation is kind of going.
So all major econ or all developed economies would love to have a high level of advanced manufacturing. Think your motor vehicles, your nuclear reactors, your jet engines, because the labor cost inside of those industries is negligible compared to the value of the actual manufactured product, right? Whereas something like sewing t-shirts has pretty much the entire cost of it is the labor that goes into it. You know, the sewing of it, the dyeing of the material, the person who cuts the little threads off at the end. Um, and one of the things that the West especially just kind of forgot is that in order to have high value manufacturing, you really also need to have a whole bunch of low value manufacturing and everything in between nearby. And that's one of the things that China got right. So like when you're trying to create a company that manufactures jet engines, you still very much need that raw material, right? You still need all the in-between steps before it actually turns into like a fin on a jet engine. And you need, the technicians to run those machines, et cetera, et cetera. And what's happened over the last 2 decades or more is that these advanced economies have gone and they've outsourced the lowest tiers of that work. You know, they've said, okay, well, we don't want to do raw mineral processing, so we'll let China do that. Okay, we don't necessarily want to do low value manufacturing like making chains and t-shirts and stuff like that. Okay, China does that. And it just went up and up the supply chain until you have um, companies in Silicon Valley that are working at such a meta level. I mean, to the extent that one of them calls themselves Meta, and they've kind of lost the ability to do something simple. I watched a YouTube video recently by, I think it's called How Stuff Works or How It's Made, or uh, where he said he wants to manufacture a grill scraper that uses chainmail entirely in the United States. And he tried really hard. And he has the capital to burn, right? But he couldn't find screws that were made or bolts that were made in the United States. And the ones that he did find, he was quite certain they weren't actually made in the United States, but they cost 5 times as much. And he couldn't get chainmail manufactured in the United States, so he ended up getting that from India. But it turns out that India had actually just resold chainmail that they'd bought from China. And it went on and on and on. And he's like, it may be theoretically possible to make this thing completely in the United States, but I haven't managed to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I think that highlights one of the challenges of this kind of narrative of like building more products locally, is that the manufacturing capacity tends to have been built up based on network effects, right? Like if you look at like innovation sort of complexes, I was looking at like like when Silicon Valley started up, it was like Xerox PARC, where you had like lots of very smart, brainy guys. They were all very close together. They were all able to manufacture very precision kind of parts in a very close proximity. Because one of the factors of innovation is you actually need to like build, especially with like physical things,
physical products,
you
yeah.
actually need to like have all the stuff and build it. So as you were saying with screws and like components, and if you can just go down the corner, around the corner and say, hey, like, can you just make this, but can you slightly tweak it so it like does this and this?
Yeah, exactly. Like, give me the prototype. You try it in the place that you need it to go, and you're like, oh, it's actually. I've been doing a bunch of like physical product design with my new 3D printer, and like stuff as simple as making a little clip that goes on the rail of the dishwasher for the little wheels, because a couple of them were broken, and I wanted to replace that. Like, I had to go through like 5 or 6 different iterations to actually get it to clip on properly, stay on, and be strong. And I also made some wall hooks for holding coats. And like something as simple as the little nails that I want to put through the wall hook, they're exactly 1 millimeter thick. However, some of them are like 1.1 millimeter thick. And so when I put them through the hole, it splits the hook along the layer lines.
Mm.
So I need to like cater to that somehow. So I went through like 3 or 4 different iterations on just making a simple wall hook. Now, if every single iteration I had to get it made somewhere else, get it down here, I mean, that would change I wouldn't do it.
Yeah, exactly. And it's almost in the same sense of like an economy where you have like a small town and you only have like you've got a baker that knows how to bake and you've got like, someone who knows how to like, butcher and make, different types of pastries or whatever. You've got like sort of this specialization that develops within those like kind of ecosystems. And especially, I think one of the samples was like Shenzhen, where it used to be like a fishing village, and now it's got like major sort of Chinese companies that are all sort of collaborating, and they're closely, you know, right next door. They probably have, I mean, I don't know if they have the same level of like job hopping as you might have in the US, but they have like at least the ability to commingle.
Mm. And if you send one of those companies like a design for something fairly complex, is like they will make it and they will source all of the parts and all the materials and everything to make it. And it will probably all come from like within Shenzhen because there's just so much industry over there. And it like that is incredible. It's exactly like Xerox PARC, as you said, except for physical manufacturing. It's just you go down the road because the Li Han down there manufactures high tensile ropes. Great. Now you've got that guy, and he, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, no, that plays such a big role in the
Yeah.
manufacturing process.
And I love going onto YouTube and just seeing like some of these guys that go into like like there's these mega parks in China where they've got all these different components and like gadgets and you can kind of like pick your mix of different components. I think there was one guy who like wanted to rebuild their entire iPhone or something like that from parts in China back in the day. But like that just being able to go to the warehouse. I remember in Cape Town actually when I was doing my studies there was kind of like one store in the whole of Cape Town that sold like electronics components.
Communica.
Uh, Communica, exactly. And there was like
Yeah.
hardly any others. And it was almost like, and I think there was like one or two companies that like could make um, printed circuit boards. And so it was like such a niche. And like, obviously there they've got like thousands of companies that could probably do each of those component parts. And so it like almost limited the ability for the ecosystem to kind of develop because you don't have that much access to it. So I kind of switch it and say or ask, if I gave you like sort of $10 million dollars or something to that tune, I think that's probably about and like 150,000 Rand, 150
10
million
million
Rand.
rand. Yeah.
Like, what would you do to kind of like either for your manufacturing process or just manufacturing in general? What would you do to kind of like bring some of that onshore or to kind of improve the situation where more of that product could be made in South Africa?
So I think that South Africa has a fairly unique regulatory hurdle. Now I think that South Africa has been kind of ambushed by the United States, both mostly because Trump and Elon are buddies, or at least were buddies. I'm not too sure of their relationship status right now, um, but it is difficult for companies above a certain size to really thrive in South Africa just due to some of the legislation that's currently imposed, and we're kind of hoping for a bit of a change over there. I don't I I think that South Africa is uniquely well positioned to be a manufacturing hub if legislation changed. I think the only thing that is in the way is legislation at the moment because we've got a large workforce, we've got some very good talent to the extent that, first world countries are trying to steal all of our engineers and our whatnots. We've got land, labor, and capital, the 3 things that you need to have a, thriving economy. And we also have a lot of really good raw materials under the ground. The unfortunate thing is that we're one of those economies where we extract raw materials, we send it off to China, who they process them into parts, and then they send those processed parts back to us. I do think that it would be good to invest in sort of mid-value manufacturing here in South Africa. You know, the kinds of things that are complicated but not super, super high value. Think, you know, industrial machinery, um, that sort of stuff. But I'm also just completely speculating as an industry outsider,
Yeah.
completely.
And do you think maybe to press on that is like, do you think consumers in South Africa are, or just consumers in the global South are open to the pr kind of prices that these like sort of more ethically managed products are giving them? Like, do you think it's like, sustainable as a business to completely only use the products and the methodologies that you're going to use?
No, 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 not at all. Is that this is very much a boutique, a boutique enterprise, and it's kind of like um, the fashion companies that make a lot of money are the ones that manufacture in Vietnam or China or Indonesia and then ship globally. And I think there's also there's a misconception that these products are of an inferior quality, is that stuff can be manufactured to whatever quality is specified, right? If you want very, very high quality products, you can get them manufactured in China. If you want really cheap products, you can also get them manufactured in China. The thing is that, especially in developed economies that have kind of lost their ability to manufacture, is whether they like it or not, they are they are going to be unable to compete, which is why you're seeing the United States playing around with these tariffs right now. And we saw the same thing back in the 90s with, you know, America was like, oh, wow, most of the motor vehicles sold over here are Japanese. We really want to incentivize onshore manufacturing and onshore vehicle manufacturing for that matter. We're going to start adding tariffs and regulations around the import of vehicles. And so they did. And then, you know, Ford and GM and all of them, you know, took off. But yeah, like Suzuki, Honda, all of them were doing really well in the United States until legislation came in to prohibit that. I think the problem that the United States currently has is that they've kind of lost their ability to do low value manufacturing. And now people are like, yeah, but we don't actually want to manufacture sneakers over here. Like that's not a job that Americans are actually interested in. I completely agree with them. I don't want to go and manufacture sneakers. There also aren't and there aren't the people to manufacture sneakers in the United States. They've got such a high employment rate that like they can't find wait staff. How you want them to go and manufacture sneakers?
And I guess also part of the problem is, or part of the whole reason to move is, I guess as you mentioned, like labor was cheaper, but it was also like environmental things, like to have like a plastic smelting factory, and I mean, I think China's had like all these like documentaries of how like polluted the air was around certain areas.
It's gotten better though.
It's gotten better, and I think one of the things that is almost like the sort of thing that's making this go faster is that because there was this period where kind of like the West dropped the ball, China kind of continued to progress and they are still outputting the most number of STEM graduates. And I think India is like closely behind them and then the US by like a far way behind. And so it's almost like once your capacity is to a certain point, your ability to manufacture at a cheaper and cheaper rate is going to be your advantage. And almost in a sense, it's kind of like there's like like a kind of like debate in terms of like capitalism and competition is like if you are continually reducing prices for your consumers and you're having the same, if not better value, is that a bad thing for consumers?
Hmm.
And is it maybe a bad thing on the whole? Um,
So I think one of the things that's really interesting is because China has kept and dramatically expanded its ability to manufacture, is the price of goods in China is very, very low. So if we adjust for purchasing power parity and we adjust for, you know, how much you can essentially buy with a dollar in the country, China already has a larger economy than the United States, right? Like if you don't play games with currency and you actually go with like what can people buy, like actually, yeah, China is kind of already beating the United States. Um, as I don't really know what that means for the United States, but I think that it has the ability to kind of pick up and rekindle being good at building again. They just need to
Yeah.
do stuff about that.
And I think part of the worry maybe is that like the as much as people despise the US in some sense, like in terms of how they're able to just constantly be winners all the time, I think there's a bit of like being a sore loser in some case. As much as that is, I think people will trust them more than China because I think although China is able to produce and they are like, on the outward side, they look like they're doing a good job and trying to help you. I think there is an element of like, at some point, if you are dependent on them, they could leverage their sort of power or their sort of position against you. And we've seen that a bit with them like building ports and stuff in throughout Africa and sort of uh, putting countries into debt. I mean, America does that too, to be honest. So it's kind of on both sides. But I think given the option, I think people would prefer to have a relationship with the
Mm.
US.
I mean, that's a broader geopolitics discussion, but I think that while there are many valid criticisms for the United States is fundamentally aligned with sort of liberal Western democracy ideals, right? Despite what the current legislation thinks, is that they are a liberal democracy. They do believe in human rights. They do believe in, the freedom of speech and the freedom of expression. They are not a state-controlled enterprise, and they don't just disappear people en masse for disagreeing with the government. And so, even though there are certain social things in the United States that I do very much disagree with, I am significantly more happy to have the United States be the de facto hegemon of the world than to have China be that, because I, I find that people who have grown up in a liberal democracy are fundamentally very culturally different to a what is essentially an authoritarian regime that, to be fair, has improved the quality of life of their people dramatically over the past 30 years. But it is misaligned from what I would like from the big boy in the world.
No, I tend to agree to maybe not make it as political. I think it's also like I think it's up to each country. I think every country should be free to trade with whoever they like. But I do believe that putting yourself in a position of weakness as an economy is not a good thing. And in any sense, I mean, like I think everyone should like strive to make their economy as sort of good and strong as possible, right? And I think this dependency factor is playing more and more of a role. And I think the only way to kind of dispel that is to at least start building that capacity in some sense locally, and at least not
Completely.
like completely wiping it out. Because I think the problem is as soon as you start removing manufacturing, then as we
You
said
become
before,
dependent.
it you become dependent and it becomes really, really hard to compete because not only is it like technically challenging, but it's also capital intensive. So you might not have the money to stand up a whole sort of supply chain for batteries, for instance. And at that point, it becomes unless you have like insane government incentives, you don't really have a way to compete with that. And so you might lose the ability to adopt some of these like technologies that could be really beneficial to your country.
Yeah, so I guess there needs to be a an effort by government, because this is like people will always act in their own best self-interest at scale, right? Like I might act the in a altruistic manner, but we can definitively say that at scale people act in their own self-interest, right? So there does need to be an incentive structure to make people manufacture onshore. It could be heavy-handed and like very rough around the edges, like the tariffs in the United States, and dubiously successful. Or it could be very much incentive, like the carrot instead of the stick, reduce taxation on manufacturing companies, government support for setting up manufacturing facilities locally, et cetera, et cetera. So there's there's something to be said about that, and each country will have its own little battle and its own unique context for that.
I think the last question I just wanted to ask is like, do you think the current generation are up for it? Like, I know you've kind of like you've had like a relative amount of success, and so this isn't like your main thing that you're doing. This is kind of something that you're like enjoying.
This is for fun.
You're doing it for fun, right? Do you think people rather just prefer to be like TikTok influencers? And like, do you even think that if there was a government incentive, it would be fulfilled by anyone other than like some boomer or like some sort of older company?
I think that if people need money and this is a legitimate way to make good money, then it is what people will do.
I guess that's right. And so the last thing is like, what are you going to call your wool company?
It's called wildest wool because
Well,
the
that's wood.
wool is very wild, being all naturally sourced South African ingredients. And wild wool was already taken, so
Okay. Did you get the .com or is it just?
I got the .com, yeah.
Oh, nice.
Ooh,
Very well done.
yeah.
Well, I look forward to seeing your wool at the next craft market, and we'll have another chat later down the line to see how it progresses.
I'll send you pictures. Yeah.
Cheers.